There is a silence in history, a vast and profound quiet carved from the ice of 100 forgotten millennia, a stillness that separates us from our ancient cousins. They are the Neanderthals, a people of heavy bones and deep thoughtful brows, a parallel humanity that for an immense age held dominion over a frozen continent. Their reign measured not in dynasties, but in the slow grinding passage of glaciers. Their story is not ours, yet it runs parallel to it, a ghost river flowing through a lost landscape of time, and to understand them is to look into a distorted mirror of ourselves, to see a path humanity could have taken, a fate we so narrowly, perhaps blindly avoided. We have painted them as brutish, simple creatures, hunched and grunting in the firelit gloom of caves. But this is a caricature born of our own insecurity, our need to be the sole inheritors of the earth. Their world was as complex, as fraught with meaning, terror, and love as our own. It was a world of immense, glacial power, of winds that could strip flesh from bone and skies, the permanent, unforgiving color of lead. But it was also a world of profound, almost suffocating intimacy, of the hearth's sacred warmth, the unbreakable bonds of the clan, and a deep instinctual knowledge of the land that we, in our noisy, disconnected modernity, can no longer truly comprehend. This is the story of one such soul, a man whose true name was a series of resonant sounds lost to the wind, but whom we shall call Kale. He was not a chieftain, for his eyes held the quiet weight of contemplation, not the fire of command. He was not the mightiest hunter, for his spirit found no particular joy in the final, desperate, bloody moments of a kill, only a grim satisfaction in the provision it meant. Kell's strength, the very core of his being, the gift that defined him, was not in the killing power of his spear arm, but in the knowing subtlety of his powerful hands. He was a maker. From a formless, sullen block of flint, his mind could perceive the perfect blade hiding within, seeing its future edge, its balance, its purpose. Before the first hammerstone was ever swung, his thick, calloused fingers could read the story of a stoneknit's hidden flaws, its secret tensions, its potential for greatness, with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his formidable frame. He was an observer, a quiet heart in a world of roar and struggle, a man destined by a cruel fate to bear witness to the long, sorrowful, and inevitable twilight of his kind, and to remember it all. The life of Kell's people, whom we shall call the clan of the red ochre, for the sacred, blood-colored pigment that anointed their tools, their bodies, for ritual, and their beloved dead for the long journey, was governed by a law as ancient and inexorable as the tides, the law of the herd. Not their own small, wandering clan of 30 souls, but the great, thunderous herds of mammoth, woolly rhino, and steppe bison that carved slow, seasonal paths across the frozen earth, their movements the very pulse of the living world. The clan's entire existence was an intricate, dangerous dance with these titans, a rhythm of migration, hunt, feast, and famine, dictated by the whims of beings far larger and more powerful than themselves. Their society was a fortress built not of stone, but of kinship, its walls mortared with an unyielding, ferocious loyalty that we can scarcely imagine. To be without a clan, to be cast out into the wind-scoured wilderness, was to be already dead, a ghost awaiting the final, lonely cold. At their head was Burrow, a chieftain whose massive, barrel-chested frame and booming guttural voice seemed to embody the raw physical power of their people. His leadership was one of brute pragmatism. He saw the world as a series of physical challenges to be met with overwhelming force and the unwavering, sacred traditions of the ancestors. The clan's memory, its soul, was held in the frail body of Mara, the ancient matriarch, whose face was a delta of wrinkles, each one a story, each line a map of a forgotten hunt or a terrible winter. She was their living link to the ancestors, her tales the only history they knew. And then there was Anya, a young woman of the clan, strong and capable, her hands as skilled at scraping hides as they were gentle in tending a wound. Her quick, rare smile and deep, understanding eyes had captured Kel's quiet heart, a silent bond forged in the shared warmth of the fire. Theirs was a world built on a foundation of brutal certainty. They knew the paths of the beasts. They knew the feel of the coming winter in their massive joints. They knew the formidable strength in their own bodies. They were the undisputed masters of their icy kingdom, and they had no reason at all, to believe that the world, their world, would not last forever. The world begins to grow old, not with a sudden cataclysm, a great flood, or a fiery mountain, but in a series of quiet, almost imperceptible sighs, in whispers of change that only the most attentive can hear, a subtle unraveling of the great tapestry. For the clan of the red ochre, the first sign was the taste of the air on the back of the tongue. It carried a new, unfamiliar sharpness, a deeper, more persistent chill that seemed to emanate from the very rock beneath their feet, a cold that lingered long after the sun had risen. The winters, always a brutal siege of darkness and howling wind, now arrived weeks earlier, their talons sinking deep into the land, and they clung on with a desperate, greedy tenacity long into the season of supposed thaw. The brief, pale summers grew shorter, their warmth thin and fleeting, a half-hearted apology from a dying sun that offered little comfort to the frozen ground. The great herds, the very anchor and purpose of their existence, grew restless and unpredictable. Their ancient migration routes, paths carved into the earth over 1,000 generations, began to shift and fray like an old rope. The mammoth seemed to wander aimlessly, the bison vanished into the gray horizons. Burro would lead the hunters on long, arduous treks, their powerful legs eating up the miles, only to find the familiar sheltered valley silent and empty, the trails cold, the air empty of the rich, musky scent of their prey. They would return to the relative safety of the cave, their broad shoulders slumped, not with the satisfying weight of meat, but with the unfamiliar, corrosive burden of failure and confusion. Mara, the old matriarch, would sit by the fire, her rheumy eyes clouded with a deep ancestral worry, staring into the flames as if reading a terrible prophecy written in the dancing embers. The great ice to the north is taking a deep breath, she would murmur, her voice as raspy as stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. It breathes in, and the world grows cold. The world is growing old, and its bones are getting stiff. A new, unsettling quiet began to settle in the land, the profound silence of absence. The clan felt it as a hollow ache in their bellies, and a colder, more insidious fear in the deepest marrow of their bones. The solid ground of their existence, the certainty of their traditions, was beginning to shift, and they were too heavy, too rooted in the ancient ways, to notice how fast they were sinking. The first time they saw them, it was from a great distance, a sighting that would later feel in Kel's memory like the first page of a final, tragic chapter, a premonition given form. He had been scouting from a high, wind-swept ridge, his sharp, heavy-browed eyes so perfectly adapted by evolution to spotting the subtle movement of prey on a vast, monotonous horizon, scanning the empty tundra. He saw a flicker of movement far below, a small, dark column of figures weaving along the frozen riverbank. But they moved all wrong. His mind, a vast catalogue of every creature of his world, found no entry for them. They were not a hunting party of his own kind, whose heavy, powerful, rolling gait was as unmistakable as a mammoth's footprint, a gait designed for power and endurance. These figures were unnervingly tall and slender, their limbs long and spindly like a water spider's. Their movements were quick, economical, and fluid, an eerie, flowing motion that seemed to skim over the landscape rather than dominate it, their feet seeming to barely touch the ground. Cale instantly dropped flat on the cold rock, his heart hammering against his ribs with a strange new emotion, a cocktail of pure, wide-eyed astonishment and a deep, instinctual unease that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He watched them make camp, saw the spark of their fire, a pitifully small, almost apologetic thing compared to the clan's great roaring hearth, yet it seemed to burn with an efficient, controlled heat. And then he heard them. Their voices, carried on the thin, cold wind, were a cascade of complex, high-pitched sounds, a chattering, whistling music utterly alien to the deep, guttural, and resonant language of his own people, a language that was more felt in the chest than heard by the ear. This new language was one of birds, of insects, of the rustling grass, a sound without weight or substance. They were the whispering people. In that moment, they felt like an omen, a new and unknown season arriving in the uncanny shape of men. When he returned to the cave and described what he had seen, his guttural words tumbling over each other in his haste, the clan fell into a rare, complete silence. Burrow grunted after a long moment, dismissing them with a wave of his massive hand as a band of gracile, weakling scavengers, not true hunters. But Mara looked into the deep heart of the fire, her old face grim and shadowed. "The world is changing," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames, "and new things are now walking upon it." The next encounter was closer, and the sense of profound wrongness it produced was infinitely more disturbing. A hunting party, led by a frustrated and angry Burrow, had managed to corner a lone, wounded bison against the icy shore of a half-frozen lake. It was a moment of triumph, a reaffirmation of their strength, as they prepared for the final, dangerous charge. A charge that required immense courage and precise coordination. They realized they were not alone. On the opposite shore, a group of the tall ones stood watching, motionless and silent. The two groups froze, a tableau of two different humanities staring at each other across a chasm of 100,000 years of separate evolution. A moment pregnant with the weight of destiny. Cale, part of the hunting party, had a clear, unobstructed view. He saw their faces, so much like his own in their basic layout: two eyes, a nose, a mouth, yet so disturbingly, uncannily different. Their brows were high and smooth, like the river stones he favored for small hand axes, lacking the noble, heavy ridge of his own people. Their chins were sharp and pronounced, their faces narrow and long, lacking the broad, powerful jaw that could chew frozen meat, and their eyes, though dark and intelligent, held a flickering, restless intensity. It was like looking at a reflection of oneself in a disturbed pool of water, familiar and yet grotesquely, terrifyingly distorted. But it was their technology that struck a blow deeper than any spear. One of the tall ones, a female with long, dark hair, gestured to a male beside her. He raised a long, thin stick, a piece of wood with a curious hook at one end. Upon it rested a spear, but one that was shockingly thin and light, more like a fragile twig than a real weapon. With a whip-like motion, a flick of the wrist that seemed to require no effort at all, the little spear launched into the air. It flew with a flat trajectory and a speed that was simply impossible, crossing the lake and embedding itself deep into a birch tree near them with a sharp, vicious thud that echoed in the silence. It was a weapon that killed from a place of absolute safety, a weapon of physics and air, not of muscle and bone. The Neanderthals, with their heavy, fire-hardened, thrusting spears, were masters of the intimate kill, the life-and-death struggle at arm's length, where courage and brute strength were paramount. This was magic. It was cowardly. It was terrifyingly effective. There was no battle, no challenge. After a long, tense moment, the tall ones simply faded back into the trees, their departure as quiet and unnerving as their arrival leaving. Kell's clan standing there, the wounded bison forgotten their minds, reeling with the implications of a death that could now arrive unseen from a world away, delivered by a people who did not even have the courage to look their kill in the eye. The image of that impossible, flying spear, its effortless speed and deadly accuracy, became a splinter in Kell's mind. It haunted his waking thoughts and troubled his dreams, while the other hunters spoke of the tall ones with a mixture of fearful contempt and brutish dismissal, calling them cowards and bone-eaters. Kell was consumed by a maker's fascination. His mind, so accustomed to seeing the perfect tool hidden within a formless stone, now grappled with the form of this new, terrifying idea. He understood the concept of a thrown rock, but this was different. This was a tool to throw another tool. He could not replicate it. The concept of the lever, of that whip-like transfer of energy, was too alien. His powerful hands, built for crushing grips and controlled, forceful percussion, were too clumsy for the delicate balance it would seem to require. So his obsession, his need to understand and to create, found another outlet. He found a large, smooth piece of mammoth tusk, yellowed with age, and in the quiet hours by the fire, when the others were asleep or lost in their weary silence, he began to work. He was not making a tool in the way his people understood it. His hands were not seeking a sharp edge or a strong point. He was making a shape, an idea given form, using a sharp flint burin he had fashioned for fine work. His hands moved with a new, strange delicacy that felt foreign to his own powerful muscles. For days, he carved, scraped, and polished with fine sand and a piece of soft leather. It was a slow, meditative process, a silent conversation between him, his hands, and the ivory. And slowly, a shape emerged. It was the figure of a woman, her hips wide and heavy, her belly swollen in the unmistakable curve of pregnancy, her head featureless, a universal symbol. It was his mate, the embodiment of her life-giving power, a prayer in ivory. The finished object was smooth, warm to the touch, and utterly useless. It could not butcher a kill, scrape a hide, or dig for roots. Its only function was to be held, to be seen, to mean something. When he shyly pressed it into Anya's hands, she looked at it with a stunned, silent wonder, her fingers tracing the curves again and again, as if it were a sacred object that had fallen from the sky. Burrow, however, saw it, grunted in disdain at the frivolous waste of good ivory that could have been made into spear points and turned away. But Cale knew he had done something new and important. In a world that was becoming frighteningly strange and empty, he had created a small piece of permanence. He had captured a feeling in solid form, a quiet act of defiance against the formless anxieties that were beginning to surround them all. The cold deepened, not in a grand, dramatic sweep, but in a slow, grinding, and methodical intensification. It was a cold that got into the bones, a damp, wearying chill that no fire, no matter how high it was piled with wood, could fully banish. The world itself seemed to be shrinking, its life force withdrawing into a frozen, inaccessible core. And then the great herds, the very bedrock of their existence. The walking larders that had sustained their people since the beginning of memory did not just shift their paths, they vanished. The vast, windswept plains, once thrumming with the movement of life, fell silent. The mammoths, whose thunderous passage had shaped the landscape and whose bodies had fueled the clan's formidable strength, were gone. The woolly rhinos, the bison, the giant deer, all gone. They had been pushed south into oblivion by a wave of cold so profound it was killing the very grasslands and tundra mosses they fed on, or they had been hunted to an unforgiving extinction by the new, terrifyingly efficient predators that moved so swiftly through the land. For the clan of the Red Ochre, this was a quiet, creeping apocalypse. Their entire culture, their intricate skills, their immense physical power, was built around the hunt of these megafauna. They knew how to read the soul of a mammoth, how to anticipate its charge, how to trap a 2-ton beast in a pit and swarm it with heavy spears in a coordinated, courageous assault that was as much a religious ritual as a hunt. Their massive, barrel-chested bodies, so perfectly adapted by evolution to generating and conserving heat in the brutal cold and creating explosive power in the hunt, now became a terrible, ironic liability. They were huge, inefficient engines that required vast amounts of fuel in the form of fat and protein, and the fuel was gone. Starvation, once a rare and temporary visitor during the hardest of winters, now became a permanent, silent member of the clan. It sat with them by the fire, a gnawing, hollow presence with cold, empty eyes. It gnawed at their bellies, a physical agony that made them weak and dizzy. But more than that, it gnawed at their certainty, at the very foundation of their world. They were the strongest people in the world, a people of muscle and rock-like bone. An enemy that was simply an empty, silent, and unforgiving horizon. While Kel's people starved in their cave, surrounded by the ghosts of their former glory, the world of the Tall Ones seemed to flourish on the scraps. The Neanderthals would find their abandoned campsites, and the evidence of their success was a constant, bitter, and deeply demoralizing torment. The ground around their cold hearths would be littered with the delicate, cracked bones of smaller, faster creatures. Countless rabbits, Arctic foxes, great flocks of ptarmigan and grouse. These were animals the clan had always ignored, too swift for their heavy spears, too small to be worth the massive effort for their huge appetites. It would take a dozen rabbits to equal the life-giving fat from a single mammoth foot. But the Tall Ones, with their fine nets woven from nettle and willowbark fibers, their intricate snares and deadfall traps, and their deadly, long-distance spear throwers, harvested this lesser bounty with an almost casual, infuriating efficiency. They were not masters of the great hunt. They were masters of relentless, incremental adaptation. Their slender, gracile bodies required far less fuel, and their inventive, restless minds saw opportunity where Kell's people saw only emptiness. Cale would spend hours studying their abandoned camps, a silent, heartbroken archaeologist of his own dispossession. He saw how they used heated stones to boil water in birch bark baskets, a concept of cooking he could barely grasp. He saw their discarded tools, and the variety was bewildering. Not just the spear points, but tiny, delicate bone needles with impossibly small eyes, found alongside scraps of hide with neat, tiny holes. Evidence of tailored clothing that would be far warmer and less cumbersome than the clan's heavy, draped hides. He found a fragment of a woven basket, a thing of such complex, ordered beauty it seemed magical. He saw a people who did not just live in the world, but actively, constantly, changed it to suit their needs. His own people were like a great, unmoving mountain, ancient and powerful, being slowly, inexorably eroded by a relentless, flowing river. The mountain's very strength, its immovability, its deep-rooted tradition, was its greatest weakness. It could not bend. It could only, in the end, break and be washed away. The first death was not a hunter lost to the vengeful tusks of a wounded beast, nor an elder giving way to the gentle cold of a final, well-learned sleep. It was a child, a young girl named Lyra, barely 5 winters old, her body weakened by months of gnawing hunger, succumbed to a sickness of the lungs, a rattling, wheezing fever that the shamans, herbs, and the clan's collective love could not touch. Her passing was not a loud, dramatic event, but a quiet, terrible fizzling out, a small light extinguished in the vast gloom of the cave. In their world, the death of a child was a rare and profound tragedy, an offense against the natural order, a sign of a deep wrongness in the world. Their birth rates were achingly slow, each new life a precious, hard-won victory against the harshness of the world. A single candle lit against an infinite darkness. Lyra's small, still body was prepared for burial with a desperate, heartbreaking reverence that bordered on hysteria. The clan mother wrapped her in the softest, rabbit fur-lined hide they owned, a hide that should have been kept for a living child to wear. They adorned it with river shells that must have been carried and treasured for generations, a pathetic attempt to give her riches for her spirit journey. Cale himself, his hands trembling with a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness, placed a perfectly formed, child-sized flint hand-axe in her limp hands, a tool for a future life she would now never have. As they laid her in a shallow grave they had painstakingly hacked from the frozen floor of the cave, a collective wail of grief rose up, a sound of pure animal agony that seemed to make the very stones of the cave weep in sympathy. But beneath the tidal wave of grief was something new and even more terrible, the cold, intellectual understanding that their strength, their traditions, their very essence was no longer enough to protect their own future. The clan had faced hardship before, they had starved before, but they had always believed in their own resilience, their ability to endure. The death of the child was a deep, irreparable crack in that belief. It introduced a new and terrible emotion into their world: hopelessness. For the first time, they looked at the long, dark winter ahead and saw not a challenge to be overcome, but an open grave, patiently waiting to receive them all. The gnawing, ever-present hunger and the creeping, silent despair began to tear at the seams of the clan's unity, a fabric woven over 1,000 generations of shared struggle and shared blood. A deep, bitter rift formed between the old ways and the terrifying, unspoken need for new ones, a chasm between pride and survival. Burrow, the chieftain, was a rock of tradition, but the world had become a river, and the rock was now an obstacle, not an anchor, a thing to be weathered away or bypassed. His mind could not, or would not, accept that the world had fundamentally changed. His entire identity, his authority, his very sense of self, was built on the glory of the great hunt, on the courage it took to face a living mountain of flesh and fury. He would still lead the hunters on ever more desperate, fruitless quests for the ghosts of the great beasts, pushing them to the brink of exhaustion and beyond, chasing memories across a barren landscape. Our strength is in the mammoth. He would roar by the dwindling fire, his voice filled with a desperate, angry pride, trying to rekindle a fire in their hearts that had long since died. Our spirit is in the rhino. To hunt the rabbit is to admit we are no longer men, but scavengers. We will not become the tall ones. We will not become weaklings who kill from a distance. Kale, in his quiet, observant way, became the unwilling nexus of a different, more pragmatic path. He did not challenge Burrow openly. That was not his nature, and it would have meant a brutal, final confrontation he could not win. But he would sit with the younger hunters, the ones whose bellies were the emptiest and whose minds were less shackled by the weight of tradition. He would show them, with his patient hands, how to nap finer, smaller flint points for lighter spears, points that could be hafted onto throwing spears. He would speak of the snares he had seen, the deadfall traps, the way the tall ones used the land's own cunning against its creatures. The world is colder, he would say softly, his voice a low rumble against the howl of the wind. The great beasts are gone. We must learn to eat what the new world gives us, or soon we will eat nothing at all. The clan was divided. The elders and the strongest, proudest hunters stood with Burrow, their identities inextricably tied to a glorious past that was now dead. The younger ones, their children sickening, their mates growing thin, looked to Kale with a desperate, questioning hope. The fire that had once unified them in a single warm circle now illuminated a clan at war with itself, torn between a past that could no longer feed them and a future they were terrified and ill-equipped to embrace. In the frozen heart of that long, cold winter, as the last of the scavenged meat was gnawed from the bones, Mara, the old matriarch, finally laid down her burdens. Her passing was not a struggle, but a quiet, graceful fading, like the last embers of a fire sinking into a bed of gray ash. She was the clan's memory, the living library of their lineage, the keeper of the stories of the great hunts, and the cruel winters of the past, of the ancestors who had come from the north, and the spirits that lived in the mountains. With her death, a part of their soul, the part that connected them to all the generations that had come before, the part that gave their hard lives meaning and context, went with her. Her burial was the last great ritual the clan of the Red Ochre would ever perform with their old, unbroken certainty. They chose the deepest, most sacred part of the cave, a natural alcove where the echoes of their voices seemed to hang in the air like spirits, and where the walls were stained with the ochre of 100 previous rituals. Hacking a grave from the iron-hard frozen earth was a monumental task that took the weakened men to full days of agonizing, back-breaking labor. They laid her in the earth on her side, as if sleeping, her knees drawn up towards her chest in the posture of a child in the womb, a return to the great Mother Earth. Following a tradition so ancient, its meaning was lost even to her. They surrounded her body with a perfect ring of ibex horns, their powerful curves a symbol of life, power, and the world of the spirits. They sprinkled her withered body with a thick layer of the sacred red ochre, the color of blood, the pigment of vitality, a final, desperate plea to give her life and strength in the cold world beyond. And in a final act of profound love and reverence, a small group journeyed for a full day into the wind-scoured, frozen land to find the tiny, stubborn purple flowers of the winter crocus, which they laid gently around her head like a fragile crown. It was a ritual of heartbreaking beauty and deep meaning. But as Kale watched them cover her body with heavy stones, sealing her away from the world of the living, he felt an overwhelming sense of finality. They were not just burying Mara. They were burying their history. They were burying their certainty. They were sealing a tomb that contained the collective memories of a people who no longer knew who they were, or what they were to become in this strange, new, and empty world. With the clan's spirit broken, their history buried, and their larders not just empty, but a mocking, hollow concept, Burrow made a final, desperate, and ultimately fatal decision. He would lead his people away from their ancestral lands, away from the graves of their fathers and the familiar, now empty valleys that had sustained them for time immemorial. He would lead them south on a great migration towards a half-remembered legend from Mara's tales, a valley of the sun where the winters were mild and the great beasts still roamed free. It was a journey born of blind hope, the last resort of a people with nothing left to lose but their own bones and the memories that were now a torment. The migration was a brutal, grinding ordeal that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. For a people so rooted in their own territory, so connected to every rock and stream of their homeland, the act of leaving was a profound spiritual wound, a self-inflicted exile. They traveled slowly, a ragged, dwindling procession of ghosts, their powerful frames now stooped and skeletal, moving across a hostile landscape that offered no comfort, no shelter, no food. The cold was a relentless physical entity, and the wind was a constant, shrieking assault that stole their warmth and their will. The old and the weak began to fail. An elder, his joints swollen with the agony of a lifetime of hardship, would sit down to rest against a frozen boulder and simply not rise again. A young mother, her milk long since dried up, would be found in the morning, frozen solid in her sleeping furs, her dead child still clutched to her breast in a final, futile, and heartbreaking embrace. Each loss was another stone pulling them down, but they had to keep moving, leaving their dead behind in shallow, hastily dug graves with no ritual, no flowers, no ochre, just a pile of frozen stones to keep the scavengers at bay. Kale walked beside Anya, his arms supporting her, her body now heavy and slow with the child she carried. A child who was now the clan's only terrifying future. He watched his people, the mightiest hunters the world had ever known, reduced to a shuffling line of skeletons, their faces etched with a profound, hollow-eyed exhaustion. This was not a journey to a new home. He knew it in his soul. It was a funeral march, and the corpse they were carrying was their own dying world. The new lands of the South were not the empty, pristine paradise of Boer's desperate hopes. Everywhere the dwindling clan went, they found the presence of the others. It was a constant, unnerving, and deeply demoralizing reminder of their own failure. It was as if they were walking through a world that had already been claimed, a world where they were no longer welcome, a world that had forgotten them, They would find the abandoned camps of the tall ones, and the signs of their infuriating success were like salt rubbed into an open wound. The ground around their cold hearths would be littered with the cracked bones of horses and red deer, clear evidence of recent, hearty feasts that made the Neanderthals' stomachs cramp with a phantom hunger. They would see strange, abstract symbols painted on rock faces, a complex, alien language that seemed to mock their own simple traditions. Most unsettling of all were the tools and trinkets they found, evidence of a mind that worked in ways they could not fathom. They discovered intricate fishing weirs left in half-frozen rivers, a technology that was utterly beyond them. They found tiny, polished beads made from shells and animal teeth strung on a piece of gut, evidence of a mind that had time for adornment, for abstract beauty, for things that served no immediate, practical purpose. It felt as though they were following in the wake of a smarter, faster, more successful people, like a pack of aging, heavy-boned wolves trailing a pride of young lions. They were ghosts haunting a world that had already moved on without them. The psychological effect was devastating. Their own deep-seated confidence, their innate sense of being the true people of the land, was completely shattered. They began to feel like intruders, like clumsy, heavy-footed beasts in a world that now belonged to someone else. They moved through the landscape, silently, fearfully, their heads down, always watching, always listening for the high, chattering voices of the ones who had so effortlessly replaced them. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, not by beasts, but by a creeping, soul-destroying sense of their own obsolescence, a feeling that was colder and sharper than any winter wind, which in the old world would have been a cause for joyous celebration and a symbol of the clan's enduring strength, had become a source of deep and constant terror, a private and lonely burden. It was a cruel paradox that gnawed at her soul day and night. Within her, she carried the future of their people, a tiny, precious spark of continuity, the last of their ancient bloodline. But in this new, starving world, that spark felt like a fire that threatened to consume her from the inside out. How could she possibly nourish a new life when she was barely sustaining her own? Her own powerful Neanderthal body, a marvel of biological engineering designed for strength, endurance, and childbirth, was now failing her. The child within her, once a joyful, reassuring flutter, now felt like a leaden weight. She would walk in a state of quiet, perpetual dread, her hand resting on her swollen belly in a gesture that was both fiercely protective and utterly despairing. She looked at the other two women left in the clan, their faces gaunt and gray, their eyes empty of everything but a dull animal suffering, and saw no hope of support, no community of mothers to help her through the coming ordeal. She looked at the men, their great strength wasted, their spirits as broken and barren as the frozen landscape they traversed, and saw no hope of provision, no promise of a safe cave or a warm fire. And she would look at Kale, her mate, the maker, the quiet observer, and see her own terror and sorrow reflected in his deep-set eyes, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of their inescapable doom. Crying child, she could not feed a child whose cries would only serve as a heartbreaking testament to her failure. The future of her people was inside her, a tiny, kicking prisoner of fate, and she felt it dying before it had even had a chance to live a final, tragic irony in a world that had turned against them. After what felt like a lifetime of wandering through their own personal hell, they finally found it. a valley sheltered from the relentless wind by high granite, cliffs with a running stream that had not yet frozen solid, and a small, gnarled stand of pine trees for fuel. It was a pocket of life in a world of death. For one brief, glorious moment, a flicker of the hope Burrow had promised. The hope of the mythical Valley of the Sun, ignited in the weary hearts of the clan. But the hope was extinguished almost immediately, snuffed out like a candle in a gale. On the other side of the valley, nestled in a wide, perfectly situated, south-facing cave, a thin plume of smoke drifted lazily into the gray sky. The tall ones were already here. This was to be the final, silent confrontation, not a battle of spears and fury, but a cold, biological audit at the end of the world. Burrow, his face a mask of grim finality, led his ragged group of survivors, no more than 15 souls, all that remained of their once proud clan, to the center of the valley. He stood there, a great, broken mountain of a man, his authority in tatters. The tall ones emerged from their cave. There were perhaps 40 of them, their bodies well fed and clad in expertly stitched furs and hides that fit them perfectly. They moved with a casual, relaxed confidence, holding their slender, deadly spears, not as weapons, but as walking sticks. They stood there, watching, their faces unreadable, their strange, dark eyes taking in the pathetic spectacle of the Neanderthals. There were no shouts, no threats, no challenges. None were needed. The brutal mathematics of survival were plain for all to see. The valley, with its limited resources, could support one clan, not two. The Neanderthals, with their massive caloric needs and their outdated, inefficient hunting methods, were a far greater drain on the delicate ecosystem. The tall ones knew it. The Neanderthals knew it. Burrow stood there, his great barrel chest heaving, his powerful frame now looking like a clumsy, inefficient relic of a bygone age. He looked at his starving, skeletal people. He looked at the confident, numerous newcomers. He might have taken a single step forward, a challenge, a final roar of defiance, dying in his throat, as he fully comprehended the crushing, absolute futility of it all. He turned, without a word, and led his clan away from the valley, away from their last, faint hope. It was not a retreat. It was an admission of extinction, a final, silent surrender to the future. In the final days, in a small, miserable rock shelter that offered little protection from the wind, as the clan huddled together, no longer speaking, waiting for the end, Cale retreated into the one place he still held some power, the landscape of his own mind. The maker in him, the quiet observer, had one last act to perform. He had no ivory to carve, no fine flint to knap. His hands, once so strong and clever, were now thin and trembling with a profound weakness, the joints swollen and aching with a cold that came from deep within his bones. He took a small, worn nub of red ochre, the sacred pigment of his people, a color that represented blood and life and the fire of the spirit, a stone he had carried since he was a boy. He crushed it into a fine powder on a flat rock, mixing it with the last of their rancid, rendered animal fat to make a crude, thick paint. He found a smooth, protected section of the cave wall, a patch of stone that seemed to catch the last dying orange rays of the afternoon sun. And there, with a focus that pushed away the hunger and the despair, he began his last creation. He did not paint a mammoth, a bison, or a scene from a glorious hunt. For the world of those great beasts was a ghost, a part of a dead past that now felt like a dream. He painted no symbols, no abstract designs of a world beyond this one. His final act was one of pure, unadorned, and desperate existence. He simply placed his left hand, the hand of his heart, flat against the cold stone, spreading his fingers wide as if to absorb some of the rock's ancient permanence, and with his right hand he carefully, painstakingly, applied the red paint all around it, filling in the space, leaving a perfect, negative image of his own hand, stark and achingly personal against the pale rock. Then he did the same with his right hand, creating a pair, a testament of his being. It was the simplest, most profound statement he could make. It was not a story or a prayer. It was a declaration that transcended language. I am. I was here. It was a gesture of pure being, a final, desperate attempt to leave a mark, a single, indelible fingerprint on a world that was systematically, pitilessly erasing him and his kind from existence. It was the defiant cry of a ghost, refusing to fade away into complete, utter, and unremembered silence. The end was not a climactic event, not a great battle, or a final, defiant roar. It was a quiet, creeping, and profoundly mundane cold. There were no more hunts, no more stories, no more arguments. There was only the sound of the wind and the deepening silence within the rock shelter, dwindled to a handful of sullen embers that no one had the strength or the will to feed. Their powerful bodies, the product of 100,000 years of evolution, marvels of adaptation to a harsh world, were finally surrendering. The cold of the cave was no longer just an external force to be endured. It was inside them now, a welcome numbness that slowed their blood and began to still their hearts. Kale lay beside Anya, her cold hand held loosely in his. Her labor had begun and ended in the deepest part of the night, a single, weak, final sigh that was more an exhalation of life than a cry of pain. They were both gone now, she and the child that had never drawn breath. He felt the cold take him, a slow, heavy, dreamless sleep pulling him down into the unfeeling earth. His last thoughts were not of the great hunts, or the tall ones, or even the gnawing hunger. Sharp crack of a flint core splitting perfectly under his control, of the smooth, cool surface of polished ivory, of the feel of the cold stone wall under his palm. He thought of the red handprint on the wall, a final, fading spark of his own essence in the growing dark, his final act of making. He was Kale, the maker, and now he was unmade. One by one, the quiet breaths in the cave ceased, but in a silent, collective, fading into the long, final winter from which there would be no spring. The silence of a parallel world gone dark, a great theater with no more actors, a type of human who had loved and dreamed, who had mourned their dead with flowers and buried them with a reverence we are only now beginning to understand, who had fought and survived for over 100,000 years in the harshest landscapes on earth, was gone. Their epic, their entire existence, with all its triumphs and sorrows, its loves and its losses, Kale and his clan were not the last inexorable extinction event playing out across a continent, a long, drawn-out sigh of a species giving up the ghost. What was their legacy but a collection of shattered bones and rough, brutish stone tools? The embarrassing remnants of a failed evolutionary experiment. But we were wrong. We found their graves filled with meaning, and we found Kel's final message. And the most profound, most ghostly discovery of all came not from a cave, but from within ourselves. Their immune systems, their resilience, survived in us. Their tragedy, then, was not one of utter failure, but of being overwhelmed by a tide of change they could not withstand. They did not lose a war, they lost a world. And their story ends not as a final defeat, but as a silent handprint on a cave wall, and as a secret, sleeping memory in the very genes of their replacements.